leptin, which is one target that people have tried to manipulate a lot with carbohydrate intake and refeeds. Leptin responds to cumulative energy balance, which means it's essentially impossible to fake that, right? The only way you can raise leptin is by raising the cumulative energy balance. And well, that's of course counter to the whole purpose of being an energy deficit.
And you can't just do it for one day, because some people, that would be their response. It'd be like, yeah, well, that's why your refeed is high carb for the weekend.
Yeah. And then you get, well, the idea is then you also get very transient spike in leptin that goes back down after when you get back into energy deficit. We also have that research on leptin that it's not enough to just go back into the deficit. You have to actually undo the energy surplus before you get back into the same level of fat loss. And then leptin is also back at the same level. So yeah, leptin and energy balance just correlate extremely strongly over time. And it's almost impossible to fake or outsmart that mechanism. Same with thyroid metabolism. Thyroid metabolism is extremely robust. Same to a large extent with things like blood sugar, but it's a bit of a different topic. In any case, as to diet breaks concretely, we recently did a study on diet breaks where we tested this idea because, okay, we know if we have this research on leptin and refeeds and the like, but we don't have that much research on diet breaks, despite a lot of even evidence-based professionals really advocating them, as you say, as if they are quite soundly evidence-based. And that's really not the case. Most research so far has found neutral effects. Some research has found slight negative effects. I think the first study by Wing and Jeffrey or whatever, they found that the effects were not as negative as they expected, meaning that the diet breaks, which at the time they thought would be detrimental to adherence, they were not detrimental to adherence, but they did found that people had some difficulty getting back into their habits and their routines and those types of diet and training behaviors. And especially over the long term, those became somewhat detrimental. Also based on that study, interestingly, where people interpret it as, oh, so they're not bad, so they're good. And the study actually kind of showed, well, they're not a negative, but they're just a waste of time. For some reason, that kind of fostered the idea of it being positive, and then a few subsequent studies all found neutral effects. And then the big swing came with the Matador study, which became super popular, and it essentially found that like a 2-week diet break every 2 weeks, I think it was, resulted in magically superior fat loss and higher maintenance of your resting energy metabolism, so your resting metabolic rate. And there were a lot of issues with that study. For one, for the resting metabolic rate, it did not actually significantly differ between groups, but they had some statistical wizardry by which they adjusted, despite not specifying how they adjusted it based on their body composition. Then they said, oh, well, after the adjustment, we saw it was better in the diet break group. Diet adherence was terrible and also not well controlled, because I think in that study, the criterion for complying with the diet was not gaining weight when they were supposed to be losing weight. That's pretty lenient, right? It's not like if you're not on target, then you're not compliant with the diet. It's like, well, if you're not going in a completely opposite direction of what we want you to do, then you're good. Also, the data essentially showed that the non-diet break group, was it 7 weeks or so into the study, they kind of got maximum fat loss and then they kind of just stopped progressing. Like they would just plateau, which is often the case in obese men that don't want to be on a diet and they're just doing it for the experiment. The diet break group seemed to kind of be able to push on a little bit longer and therefore ended up with greater total fat loss. So it was mostly a matter of diet adherence in a context that's not really relevant for serious strength trainees. And then came, I think, 1 or 2 more studies with neutral effects that didn't really become popular. We had the IceCap study and our current study, which were very similar, conducted at the same time. They both were also similar in design and similar in finding. So what we did is we had a lot of strength-trained women go on a diet either in one stretch or with diet breaks in between. And we did 1 week diet break after every 2 weeks of dieting. That's a little much, but we wanted to stick kind of to the Matador study design, which even at 2 week diet breaks after every 2 weeks, but we were like, yeah, that's clearly, nonsensical. Nobody does that. So we did 1 week every 2 weeks. We also adjusted the volume because in the previous research, although it didn't seem to matter, they just did the same training volume, which meant that the diet break group was essentially doing multiple extra weeks of strength training at maintenance energy intake. So we adjusted the volume to be the same over the groups on average as a whole. Same average deficit, well controlled for diet adherence, serious energy deficit, 25% energy deficit. And then we measured like everything. So body composition measurements, strength variables, 8 different measurements of psychological constructs like hunger, ease of sticking to the diet, overall diet adherence and attrition rates. And we found on all of these things that there were no significant differences between groups, except for 2 measurements, which are of questionable relevance. One is that on the at-home measurement of body composition, so we did 2 measurements. one better with lab grade, and one at home with Bayer scales. And they're not very reliable, but the Bayer scales actually found that the diet break group lost more lean body mass. So the better measurements did not verify that. So I wouldn't put any stock into it. But clearly, the data did not show a superior muscle retention effect of the diet breaks. And then the only other significant difference between the groups was that the diet break group in our study had lower disinhibition. It's
double negative.
Double inhibition is kind of already it's like a triple negative. So it basically means less compulsion. So disinhibition is like when the same effect you would get when you're intoxicated, as in with alcohol, that you're just doing what you want, kind of impulsive. And in terms of diet adherence, that could mean that, if you're more impulsive, you're more likely to snack and the like. It didn't actually change their eating behaviors. Like their actual eating behaviors did not differ between groups. It did not make a difference in their actual diet adherence. So
how was that measured? Just there were questions related to how they felt then?
Yeah, they have surveys for all these things.
But it wasn't based on actual behavior. It was just how they felt, I guess.
We did both, exactly. So it's like they reported that they were less disinhibited based on those survey results, but in their actual actions, they were not. Actions speak louder than words, if you ask me. I wouldn't put much stock into that. Plus, like in statistical terms, there is a significant chance of a type 1 error. When you measure so many different things, it's quite likely that one of these things ends up being different between groups just by chance. Like the more things you measure, the more likely it is that some of these things, you're just going to accidentally find a difference that's not really there. So because there's always some noise in the data. The groups are not exactly the same. They're different women. Maybe something happened in the lives of some of the women, not in the others, blah, blah, blah,
And when you say find a difference, just for people listening, you mean a difference that would appear to check out in terms of statistical significance, but actually is caused by something other than what you think.
Exactly. So when you get a statistically significant difference, which means the data show that the statistical algebra shows that it's unlikely to be due to chance, or it seems that way, but actually it is probably chance because you've tested so many things that sometimes that just slip through the cracks, if you will. And the ICECAP study, which is very similar to ours, they also found similar findings, like no difference overall. I'm not sure if they measured disinhibition directly, but they also found no difference between groups, the vast majority of all these measures. And they subjected their subjects to a whole battery of tests. And the only difference they found was lower appetite in the diet break group, but again, not enough to change eating behavior. And I think they measured appetite in 4 different ways, and it different on one, but not the other 3, and also not on actual energy intake, right? So again, that's very questionable relevance. And we did not find any difference in appetite or prospective consumption, any of these measurements. So overall, I would say that, especially if you combine it with the previous studies, most literature at this point finds that diet breaks are essentially a waste of time. They don't achieve anything. A worse outcome than many people realize, because many people are like, well, in one study, lower disinhibition, one study, maybe less appetite, overall, maybe a trend towards positive effects of diet breaks. You're spending weeks extra on a diet. So in our case, it was 33% more time on a diet. I think in the ICECAP study, it was 25% more time on a diet. So that's 1 week per 3 or 4 weeks of dieting that you add to that. And you're achieving nothing. And in the ICECAP study, even they were still doing their full volume of strength training as well. And that didn't even seem to make a difference. Overall, I would say it's not just that it's ineffective, it's that you're actually investing effort into it that's not paying off, right? You could have spent that time cutting further, or bulking, or, which I think is in the vast majority of cases the better solution when people need a diet break or they feel it could be helpful, is to just diet more slowly. My big deal with a diet break for most people is that when you feel the need for a diet break, that should be a red flag. That should tell you, okay, I currently feel like I can't sustain this. And if you can't sustain the diet, that is, of course, that's a huge problem. And especially in terms of long-term lifestyle management, if you don't feel like you can sustain what you're doing now, you should change what you're doing. And a diet break isn't going to solve anything. It's essentially sticking your head in the sand, because you're going to take a break. Then afterwards, you're going to come back and you're going to see if the problem's still there. And yes, it will be, because you're going to go back into the same energy deficit. If you're going to do the same things, you're going to get the same outcome again. So I think diet breaks are very much kind of a wishful thinking mindset of, we can try to outsmart the body in a way, and it sounds great. You can take a break and you get better results on top of that. Just like refeeds, it's a very easy sell, like, hey, for 1 day of the week, you can eat pancakes all you want, and you're going to get better results at the end of that. That's kind of how it sounds for people. So it's an easy sell. It's kind of wishful thinking, but really, it just doesn't do anything.